Thank you, Paul, and thank all of you for coming this evening. This is a really important topic. It's a topic that we have done a tremendous amount of work on over the last 14, 15 years, and are really grateful for the leadership that Paul and PEPG have provided here. I want to say how particularly thankful I am to Antonio Wedland, Associate Director here, who really makes a lot of these events here possible and successful. So we're really indebted to your work and your whole team. So, we're fortunate this evening to have with us, as Paul mentioned, the lead plaintiff, Kendra Espinoza, and her two daughters, Naomi and Sarah, with us, as well as Erica Smith from the Institute of Justice, who is one of the lawyers in this case, as well as Mike Gillerin, who is a Boston attorney who has been so helpful to us as we've been filing briefs in support of this case. I always say that this topic, this school choice topic and topics around anti-aid amendments, or what they call Blaine amendments, it's really the most interesting topic that we do. The reality is that there's something for everyone in it. There's education, there's religion, there's law, there's history, there's the whole gamut here for us to take a look at this evening. And one of the things that I'm always reminded, though, in a lot of the conversations with all the debates about the legal aspects and the history and the politics of it is that this is fundamentally about the right of parents to direct the educational outlook of their children. This is a fundamental birthright from my point of view, and it's a birthright here in this Commonwealth. And so Kendra and Erica and Mike will tell you a little bit more about the case. We've tried to kind of have folks look at various pieces of it. One of the things I want to try to do is give you some of the historical touchstones or sort of the vocabulary so that we can understand the topic a little better. And I've done that with a couple PowerPoint slides. The first one here is a very famous, or infamous actually, cartoon from the mid-19th century. Thomas Nast was sort of the cartoonist of the mid-19th century. Harper's Weekly was the magazine that was the magazine of record. And what you have here is some crocodiles in the shape of bishop's miters coming up out of the water, and these poor American school children are being protected by this school teacher, earnest-looking fellow. But the reality is that it's one of the worst examples of nativism, and it helps to kind of set the historical context for these anti-aid amendments, the nativism, and ultimately the Blaine amendments that led to the conversation that we're having now. There's also a fairly provocative quote here from Abraham Lincoln. He was not president yet, but he made it clear what his view was of the Know-Nothing Party. And the Know-Nothing Party really, the Know-Nothing Party really was this nativist movement from the mid-19th century, right? 5-6 years before the American Civil War, that was animated by anti-Catholicism, anti-immigrant impulses. But really what they were rebelling against, in a way, was the original outlook of the Founding Fathers. The Founders, of course, were men of the Enlightenment, so the reason and science and a sort of healthy respect for religion was the hallmark of that our early republic. They were not as sort of concerned about the issues of church and state that we are today. And ultimately, in the early part of the 19th century, as you saw common schools and these nativist parties, they began to try to draw harder lines between church and state than the founders originally had. Here's a lengthy quote from John Adams, who drafted the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. It's the oldest written constitution in continuous use. And a quote from Jefferson. It gives you, in a sense, in a way, how much more enlightened or perhaps liberal they viewed politics and the relationship between government and religion. But as the potato famine occurred in the 1840s, and there was a huge influx of Irish Catholic immigrants, particularly to the Northeast. You began to see more and more vehement kind of reactions against immigration and Catholics in particular. The Irish need not apply signs were infamous here in Massachusetts throughout a lot of the 19th century, in particular the latter part of the 19th century. But there was a burning of a convent over in Charlestown in 1834. Samuel Morse, who invented the Morse code, that was sort of the internet, if you will, of that era, dramatically increased communications across the country, was himself a nativist and published a pretty inflammatory book about immigration. And then there was some anti-Catholic rioting in New York City and Philadelphia. But here in Massachusetts, we call them the Know Nothing amendments in Massachusetts because they're proto-Blaine. They're 30 years before the Blaine amendments that we're all be wrestling with. But the Governor Henry Gardner, whose portrait infamously sits next to the entrance of the House of Representatives in Massachusetts, he was the leader of the Know Nothing Party. He was the Know Nothing governor, and he was the one who led the effort for, if it wasn't the earliest, it was among the earliest anti-aid amendments in the United States, which is still with us here today. And in fact, it was the largest electoral landslide in Massachusetts state history. They carried every constitutional office and all but 2 legislative seats. And with that supermajority, they were able to adopt this anti-aid amendment. So this is an example of the anti-aid amendment. This is it's fairly clear that they were trying to wall off money primarily to the K-12 system or the elementary and secondary system. They really left higher education alone because the reality is that higher education in this country, in this state, had been receiving state subsidies, and they were doing so in order to train ministers. So they allowed that to continue in the higher ed system, but in the K-12 system and other state-funded services, they were largely cut off. And I think most people consider the Massachusetts anti-aid amendment or Know Nothing amendment is if it's not the worst, it's certainly among the worst, and it is, if it's not the oldest, it's among the oldest and the toughest. And then in 1917, and when there was another round of anti-immigrant impulses, there was a protective second amendment that was put around this first Know Nothing amendment that prohibited that first Know Nothing amendment from being repealed through the initiative petition process, so you could not put it on the ballot. That is the man, James Blaine. So he was a fairly prominent Republican politician from Maine, state of Maine, who worked really in conjunction with Ulysses S. Grant, who was president in the late 19th century, to push for a national Blaine amendment that would wall off any public money going to parochial schools or parochial school parents. And he came within just a couple of votes of getting that passed in the United States Congress. But really what happened is that then the states really took up the lead. And where we stand today on this topic is that 38 states of the 50 states have Blaine amendments. But it was really a long tradition of anti-Catholic, primarily animus, that at that time was intended to prevent money going to religiously affiliated schools or parents that wanted to send their kids to religiously affiliated schools. And that's the legacy. You see the most recent one is Michigan. I think that's often considered the worst. It was 1970. And there's been a variety of efforts to repeal them, including a couple efforts in the late 80s, early 90s here in Massachusetts that were unsuccessful. Anyway, well, that brings us really a kind of a little table setting to the real reason why we're here and the real people we're here to hear speak, which is Kendra Espinoza, the mom of these 2 wonderful young kids who a century or more after Blaine, we're still wrestling with these issues. And that's why we're so pleased and honored really to have her here with us this evening, and we are really pleased to have her in Boston and look forward to your thoughts on the topic. Thanks.